There's a moment I still replay the second before everything changed. My stepmother stood in that courtroom, chin lifted, certain she'd already won. "Without us, she'd have nothing," she said loud enough for the whole gallery to hear, loud enough that her lawyer smiled. I said nothing. I just sat there in my dress uniform, hands folded, while my own family laughed at me like I was a joke they'd been telling for years. What none of them knew, what none of them had ever bothered to ask, was about to walk into that room and change everything. My name is Megan Sullivan, and I've spent 17 years learning how to sit still while people underestimate me. It's a skill the Army teaches you without ever putting it in a manual. You learn it in briefings where men twice your age assume you're there to take notes. You learn it in convoys where someone asks if you're allowed to be in charge. And you learn it apparently in a Virginia courtroom in July, 3 months after burying your father, while his widow tells a room full of relatives that you'd have nothing without her. I sat in the second row, spine straight, my service uniform pressed the way it always is, ribbons in their exact order. Because that morning I needed something to hold on to, and precision was the only thing that had never failed me. Linda Sullivan walked in wearing black that looked more expensive than anything my father had ever bought her, and she looked at me the way she always had, like I was a rounding error in her life, an inconvenience she'd tolerated for the sake of appearances. "Without us, she'd have nothing," she said to her sister, not even bothering to lower her voice, and the sound carried across the gallery like she'd rehearsed it. My Aunt Carol laughed. My cousin Tim smirked and looked away when I caught his eye. Nobody in that room had ever asked me what I actually did for a living. They knew I wore a uniform. They knew I moved around a lot. Beyond that, I was just Megan, the one in the Army, a woman who'd apparently traded a normal life for a government paycheck and had no business questioning how her father's estate got divided. I let them think it. I'd been letting them think it for years, ever since I finished my law degree quietly on my own time between deployments and duty stations, never once bringing it up at Thanksgiving because nobody had ever asked a real question about my career beyond, "So when do you get out?" I didn't correct them. I didn't explain that after 12 years as a logistics officer, I'd transferred into the Judge Advocate General's Corps Reserve, that I'd spent the last 5 years reading contracts and trust documents and probate law in whatever spare hours the Army left me. Why would I explain that to people who'd already decided who I was? Linda's attorney, a tall man named Preston with a voice built for closing arguments, stood and addressed the judge with the kind of confidence that comes from believing the other side hasn't done its homework. "Your Honor, Ms. Sullivan?" He meant me, and he didn't even use my rank, which I noted the way you note small things right before they become large things. Has submitted a request for co-management of the trust that frankly has no legal foundation. She has no standing beyond being a beneficiary, and even that status is being contested given her limited involvement in her father's affairs these past several years. Limited involvement. I thought about the last conversation I'd had with my father 6 weeks before his heart gave out in his study, the two of us on a video call while I was stationed in Georgia, going line by line through amendments to a trust document. Neither of them knew I'd helped him write. I thought about the folder still sitting in my car, thick with bank records, and correspondence I'd spent 3 months quietly assembling. Limited involvement. I didn't move. I didn't argue. I'd learned a long time ago that the moment you raise your voice in a room that's already decided not to listen to you, you've lost something you can't get back. So I sat there, hands folded in my lap, watching Judge Ellery Whitfield flip through the documents in front of him, with a small crease forming between his eyebrows, the kind of crease that meant he was reading something that didn't match what he'd been told to expect. Linda leaned toward her sister again, whispering something that made them both smile, and for a moment I let myself feel it, the old ache of being dismissed by people who shared a house with my father for 11 years, and never once bothered to understand who I actually was. It wasn't new. It had just never mattered this much before. The judge looked up. He glanced at Preston, then at Linda, then longer this time at me. Something in his expression shifted, the way a man's face changes when he realizes the story he's been told doesn't line up with the paperwork in his hands. "Major Sullivan," he said, and the room went quiet in a way it hadn't been quiet all morning. I stood. 17 years of training kept my shoulders level, my breathing, even though my heart had started to climb. Behind me, I heard Linda's small, confused laugh cut off mid-breath. The judge looked back down at the documents, then up at me again, and this time the crease between his eyebrows had turned into something closer to disbelief. "There's something in here," he said slowly, "that I think this court needs clarified before we go any further." Nobody in that room understood yet what was about to happen. But I did. I'd been waiting 3 months for this exact moment, and I intended to let the truth do what I never had speak for itself. 3 months earlier, my father was alive, and I was still the daughter who called every Sunday and visited when the army let me. Then his heart stopped in his study on a Tuesday afternoon, and by the time I landed at Dulles 2 days later, Linda had already changed the locks. I remember standing on the porch of the house I grew up in, my duffel bag still over my shoulder, watching my key fail to turn in a lock that had never once resisted me before. Linda opened the door herself, and there was something in her face, not grief, not even discomfort, just a kind of settled certainty, like she'd already moved past the part where she needed to pretend. I had the locks changed for security. She said, though, we both understood that wasn't true. "It's been a difficult time. I'm sure you understand." I did understand, actually. I understood more than she realized. But I only nodded and asked if I could come in to see some of my father's things, his old journals, a few photographs from before Linda, the small collection of items that had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with the fact that he'd been my father for 36 years before he'd been her husband for 11. "Everything in this house belongs to me now," she said, not cruelly, just flatly, the way you'd state a fact about the weather. "Your father made sure I'd be taken care of. I don't think there's anything here that concerns you." I asked again, quieter this time, for just the journals. She told me she'd have to think about it, which we both knew meant no. 2 days later, when I drove back to collect a few boxes I'd left in the garage from my last visit, I found them sitting outside on the driveway in the rain. My old uniforms and photographs soaked through a box of my mother's letters. My mother, who'd died when I was 19, warped and unreadable at the bottom of a cardboard box that had given up under the weight of the water. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect a certain kind of reaction, and I never gave anyone the satisfaction of it. I stood in that driveway and I felt something colder than sadness settle into my chest. Something with edges, something that didn't dissolve the way grief eventually does. My Aunt Carol called that evening to tell me I should let it go, that my father would have wanted peace in the family, that Linda had been through a lot too. My cousin Tim texted something similar, a paragraph about how Dad had built a new life and how maybe it was time I respected that. Nobody asked how I was doing. Nobody asked what I'd lost sitting on that driveway. They'd already decided whose side made sense, and it wasn't mine. I went back to the hotel I was staying in that week and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without turning on the lights. Then I picked up my phone and called a number I hadn't used in almost a year. Not a relative, not a friend, but a colleague from the small firm in Alexandria, where I'd done my clinical hours during law school, a woman named Patricia Voss, who now specialized in estate and trust litigation. "Megan," she said when she picked up, surprise evident in her voice. "It's been a while." "I need your help with something," I told her. "But I need you to understand this isn't just a client relationship. This is my father." I didn't cry telling her what happened, but my voice did something it rarely does. It shook just slightly on the word locks. Patricia listened without interrupting the way good attorneys learn to do, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment before she spoke. "Do they know what you do?" she asked. "Do they know about the bar exam, the trust work you did with your father?" "No," I said. "They think I'm just an officer. They've always thought that." There was a pause, and I could almost hear her weighing something. "That might be the most useful thing you have right now," she finally said. "Nobody prepares a defense against something they don't know exists." I sat with that for a long moment after we hung up. My father used to say something similar, actually, back when I first told him I was pursuing my law degree quietly, without announcing it to the extended family. He'd smiled at me over coffee and said, "Some things are more powerful when people don't see them coming, Megan. Let your work speak when it needs to, not before." I hadn't understood at the time why that mattered so much to him. Sitting in that hotel room staring at a box of ruined letters in my mind, I started to understand it a little more clearly. Linda believed she already knew who I was. She believed the story she'd built the stepdaughter in a uniform, distant, unimportant, easily managed. She had no idea that story was about to become the very thing that unraveled her. I didn't call another family member that night. I didn't argue and I didn't demand anything back. I simply opened my laptop, pulled up the encrypted folder where I'd saved copies of trust documents my father and I had worked through together over video calls the past several years, and began reading through them again, slowly, carefully, the way you read something when you finally understand its full weight. Somewhere in those documents was the truth Linda hadn't bothered to look for, and I intended to find every last piece of it before I ever said a word. Grief. I learned that summer works better as fuel than as a wound you nurse in private. So instead of mourning in the conventional way, instead of letting myself sit in that hotel room replaying the driveway, the ruined letters, the sound of Linda's voice calling my father's house hers, I did the only thing that ever made sense to me. I built a case. Patricia helped where she could, but most of the work was mine, done in the early mornings before my reserve duties, and in the late evenings after them, spread across a rented desk in a temporary apartment I'd taken near Fort Belvoir. I requested certified copies of every financial document tied to my father's estate, bank statements, brokerage account, histories, deeds to the vacation property in the Blue Ridge. The paperwork behind the trust itself dated back nearly a decade. It surprised me honestly how much of it I already understood. 5 years of study done quietly on nights and weekends while stationed at 3 different posts hadn't just given me a license to practice law, it had given me fluency in a language most people spend their whole lives avoiding, the language of fiduciary duty, of successor trustees, of what a spendthrift clause actually protects against. My father had taught me some of it himself, during those long video calls where he'd walk me through decisions he was making about his own estate, asking my opinion the way you'd ask a colleague, not a daughter he was trying to shelter from hard truths. I remember one call in particular, maybe 2 years before he died, when he told me he was updating the trust to include a provision I didn't fully understand at the time. "Just in case," he'd said in that steady voice of his, the one that never explained more than it needed to. "Some people show you who they are slowly, Megan. I want to make sure the paperwork catches up before anyone gets hurt." I hadn't pressed him on it then. I wish now that I had, if only to have heard him say it plainly instead of leaving me to piece it together from a locked house and a driveway full of rain-warped photographs. While I worked, Linda moved. She wasn't subtle about it, which almost made things easier. Within 6 weeks of my father's death, she'd sold his 1967 Mustang, the one he'd restored himself over a decade of weekends, to a collector in Richmond, for what I later learned was well below market value. She needed the sale to close quickly, and quick sales rarely favor the seller. She sold 2 paintings from the study, minor pieces but not worthless. through an auction house that handled the transaction with almost no paper trail beyond a single invoice. And she began quietly transferring shares from a family investment account into one under her name alone, a maneuver she likely assumed no one was tracking closely enough to notice. I noticed everything, actually, because for the first time since the funeral, I had something to focus my attention on besides the ache of being shut out, and focus, for me, has always been a kind of anesthesia. By the 8th week, I had a file nearly 4 inches thick, transaction records, trust language email correspondence between Linda and a financial advisor discussing liquidating some of the estate assets before things get complicated. That phrase alone told me everything about her intentions. She wasn't confused about the boundaries. She was betting that no one capable of enforcing them would ever look closely enough to catch her. Patricia reviewed the file with me over coffee one Saturday morning, flipping through pages with the quiet concentration of someone who'd seen plenty of estates fall apart, but rarely with documentation this thorough. "This is airtight," she said, eventually tapping the trust amendment pages. "Whoever helped your father draft these clauses knew exactly what they were protecting against." I didn't say anything to that. I just nodded and gathered the pages back into order. "We could go public with your background now," Patricia said, carefully watching my face. "It would end this quickly. Once opposing counsel knows what they're dealing with, they'll likely push for a settlement before it ever reaches a courtroom." I thought about it for a long moment, turning my coffee cup slowly on the table between us. Part of me wanted exactly that. A fast resolution and end to the sleepless nights, the phone calls from relatives urging me to let it go. But another part of me, the part that had spent 17 years learning patience in rooms full of people who underestimated me, wanted something else. I wanted Linda to stand in front of a judge, certain of her victory, and say out loud the thing she'd been implying for months. I wanted the truth to arrive exactly when it would matter most, not a moment before. "Not yet," I said. Patricia raised an eyebrow but didn't push. She knew me well enough from our clinic days to trust that when I made a decision like that, it wasn't hesitation. It was strategy. 2 weeks later, the court date was set. Linda's attorney filed aggressively, painting me in the petition as an absent daughter, attempting to interfere in a grieving widow's rightful inheritance, a woman with no demonstrated legal or financial standing to challenge the estate's handling. I read that phrase 3 times when the papers arrived, and for the first time in months, I actually smiled. They had no idea what was sitting in the folder on my desk. They had no idea what 4 inches of paper and 5 quiet years of study were about to do to the story they'd built about who I was. I closed the folder, set it beside my uniform for the morning, and allowed myself finally to feel something close to ready. The morning of the hearing, I put on my dress uniform, the way I'd put on every uniform for 17 years, methodically, without rushing each piece in its place, before I allowed myself to think about what the day actually meant. Patricia met me outside the courthouse in Fairfax, her briefcase noticeably heavier than usual, and gave me one last look before we walked in together. "Remember," she said quietly, "let them talk first. Let them build the whole house before we show them it's got no foundation." Inside, the courtroom filled quickly. Linda arrived with an entourage that felt more suited to a social event than a legal proceeding. Her sister, 2 cousins from my father's side, who'd apparently decided loyalty meant siding with whoever controlled the checkbook, and Preston, her attorney, moving through the room with the easy confidence of a man who'd already won cases like this a dozen times before. Judge Ellery Whitfield entered a few minutes later, a tall man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of weathered patience that comes from decades of watching families destroy each other over things their loved ones never intended to become weapons. He nodded for the proceedings to begin, and Preston rose almost immediately, clearly eager to set the tone before I had a chance to speak at all. "Your Honor," he began, "what we have here is unfortunately a fairly common situation. A grieving widow attempting to honor her late husband's wishes, facing interference from a stepdaughter who has shown minimal involvement in the family's affairs for years, and who now, following her father's passing, seeks to insert herself into decisions she has no legal or practical standing to make. He gestured toward me without quite looking at me the way you'd gesture at an exhibit rather than a person. Major Sullivan has submitted a request to co-manage a trust valued at several $1,000,000. She has provided no evidence of financial expertise, no professional qualification, and frankly no compelling reason why this court should disrupt Mrs. Sullivan's rightful management of her late husband's estate. Linda sat beside him with her hands folded the corners of her mouth, pulled into something just short of a smile. The expression of a woman watching a verdict she'd already written play out exactly as expected. She glanced toward me once briefly, and I recognized the look. It was the same one from the driveway, the same certainty that had let her leave my mother's letters out in the rain. Preston continued for several more minutes, walking the judge through Linda's version of events, my distance from the family, my limited understanding of financial matters, my apparent attempt to profit from a father's death rather than honor his memory. Each sentence landed like a small, deliberate stone building a wall meant to keep me exactly where they believed I belonged. I didn't interrupt. I sat with my hands folded the way I had in part one, watching Judge Whitfield's expression as he listened, occasionally glancing down at the documents Patricia had submitted weeks earlier. Documents that I suspected told a very different story than the one currently filling the room. When Preston finally sat down, the judge was quiet for a long moment, flipping slowly through the pages in front of him. I watched his eyes move across a particular section, then flip back a page, then forward again, the crease between his eyebrows deepening the way it had the first time I'd noticed it. "Mr. Preston," the judge said slowly, "I want to make sure I'm understanding your position correctly. You're stating that Major Sullivan has no legal standing to participate in the management of this trust, and no relevant expertise to evaluate its terms." "That's correct, Your Honor." Preston said, a note of confidence creeping into his voice, sensing an opportunity to reinforce his point. "And Mrs. Sullivan?" The judge continued, turning his attention briefly to Linda. "You've stated in your filing that your husband made no arrangements involving his daughter beyond a standard inheritance distribution." "That's right," Linda said, her voice steady, certain. "David handled all of that himself. I don't believe Megan was ever involved in any of the planning." The judge nodded slowly, still looking down at the documents. Then he looked up, and this time his gaze settled directly on me, holding there for a moment longer than courtroom procedure usually calls for. "Wait," he said, almost to himself, the words slipping out before he seemed to fully decide to say it. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something unplanned interrupts a rhythm everyone had settled into. "Your Honor," Preston asked, clearly caught off guard. The judge looked at Linda, then at Preston, then back at the document in his hands. "They really don't know," he said, more to himself than to anyone in the room, but the acoustics carried it to every corner regardless. Preston glanced sideways at Linda, confusion flickering across his face for the first time since the hearing began. "Know what, Your Honor?" The judge set the papers down slowly and looked directly at me as though he needed my permission before he said the next thing out loud. I felt every eye in the room shift in the same direction, felt Linda's confident posture beside her attorney falter just slightly, though she likely couldn't have said why. I met the judge's gaze and gave him the smallest nod, the kind of nod that says, "Go ahead," the kind I'd been waiting 3 months to give. "Because she's," the judge began, and then he stopped, letting the silence stretch just long enough that I could feel the entire room lean forward without moving an inch. "Because she's a licensed attorney," Judge Whitfield said, his voice carrying the particular weight of a man who understood exactly how much that sentence was about to change in his courtroom. "Admitted to the Virginia State Bar 5 years ago. Currently serving in the Judge Advocate General's Corps Reserve." For a moment, nobody moved. I watched the words travel across the room the way ripples move across still water, reaching Linda's sister first, then my cousin Tim, then finally Linda herself, whose expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to something that looked almost like fear. "That's..." Preston started, then stopped flipping frantically through his own copy of the filing as though the answer might be hiding somewhere in the margins. "Your Honor, that information wasn't disclosed in any of the initial filings." "It didn't need to be for the purposes of establishing standing," the judge said calmly. "But it becomes rather relevant given what else is in front of me." He picked up another set of pages, these ones stapled separately, and held them up briefly before setting them back down. According to these records, Major Sullivan didn't simply inherit an interest in this trust. She helped draft portions of it. Linda's hand found the edge of the table, gripping it the way you grip something when the floor has started to feel less solid than it did a moment ago. "That's not possible," she said, quieter now, the confidence I'd watched her wear like armor for 3 months finally beginning to crack. "David never mentioned anything like that. Perhaps not to you," the judge said, not unkindly, but without softening the truth either. "But the documentation is quite clear. Several email exchanges between Mr. Sullivan and his daughter, dated over the course of roughly 4 years, discuss specific language in the trust's amendments. There are drafts with tracked changes attributed to an email address belonging to Major Sullivan. There are also billing records from a private consultation she provided, which she declined to charge for. Interestingly enough, given her relationship to the settler. I sat perfectly still, though. Inside I felt something loosen slightly, a tension I hadn't fully acknowledged carrying for 3 months finally beginning to release. I thought about those calls with my father, the ones where he'd ask my opinion on wording, where he'd tell me to read something twice before I gave him my answer, where he'd occasionally laugh and say, "You're better at this than half the attorneys I've paid for, you know that." I'd never taken it as anything more than a father being generous with his daughter. Sitting in that courtroom, I understood it had been something closer to preparation. Preston stood again, visibly recalibrating. "Your Honor, even if Major Sullivan possesses legal qualifications, that doesn't automatically grant her standing as co-trustee. There would need to be explicit designation within the trust document itself." "There is," the judge said simply, and something in his tone suggested he'd been waiting for exactly this objection. Section 14, subsection C, added as an amendment 3 years ago. It names Megan Sullivan as successor co-trustee effective immediately upon any breach of fiduciary duty by the primary trustee. He looked up first at Preston, then at Linda. "I haven't yet determined whether such a breach has occurred, but given the transaction records also included in this filing, the sale of a vehicle, the sale of 2 paintings, and several transfers from a joint investment account into an account held solely by Mrs. Sullivan, I intend to examine that question very closely." Linda's face had gone the color of the courthouse walls. She turned to Preston, whispering something urgent, and I watched him lean toward her, his expression tightening as she spoke, the two of them clearly realizing in real time that the case they'd built rested on assumptions about a woman neither of them had ever bothered to actually understand. I hadn't planned to speak at that moment, but something in the silence that followed felt like it needed filling, not with anger, but with clarity. I rose slowly, smoothing the front of my uniform out of habit more than necessity. "Your Honor." I said, my voice even the same voice I'd used in briefings for commanding officers who'd initially doubted whether I belonged in the room. I didn't disclose my background earlier in these proceedings because I didn't believe it should be necessary. The terms of my father's trust speak for themselves regardless of who I am or what I do for a living. I would have preferred this hearing focus entirely on whether those terms were honored, not on credentials. The judge nodded slowly, something that might have been respect passing briefly across his face. "A fair position, Major, though I suspect it's a bit late for that now." Linda was staring at me, and for the first time in 3 months I saw something other than certainty in her expression, something closer to the realization that she'd spent the last several months building an entire narrative about a woman she'd never actually taken the time to know. It wasn't triumph I felt watching that realization land. It was something quieter, sadder almost. The recognition of just how much simpler this could have been if she'd simply asked me a single honest question at any point over the past 11 years. The judge gathered the documents in front of him into a single stack and looked out across the courtroom. "I think," he said, "before we go any further, it would be prudent to review the sealed letter Mr. Sullivan left with this court to be opened only in the event of a dispute over the trust's administration." A clerk near the bench rose and retrieved a sealed envelope from a locked case, carrying it forward with the particular care reserved for things that matter. Linda's eyes followed it the entire way, her expression somewhere between dread and disbelief, as though some part of her had already begun to understand that whatever was written inside would finish what this hearing had already started. The clerk handed the envelope to the judge, who examined the seal carefully before breaking it open with a small silver letter opener kept for exactly this purpose. The courtroom had gone almost unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that settles over a room when everyone understands without needing to be told that something irreversible is about to happen. Judge Whitfield unfolded a single sheet of paper, and I recognized my father's handwriting even from across the room, the particular slant of his letters, the way he crossed his sevens out of some old habit from an engineering class decades ago. I hadn't seen that handwriting in months, and something in my chest tightened at the sight of it, though I kept my face still the way I'd trained myself to for years. The judge read silently, first his expression unreadable, before he began to read aloud. "To whoever presides over any dispute regarding the administration of my estate." He began, "I am writing this letter not because I expect conflict, but because I have lived long enough to understand that even good people can convince themselves of things that aren't true, particularly when money is involved." He paused briefly, glancing at Linda before continuing. "My wife Linda has been a devoted partner to me for 11 years, and I want it understood clearly that she is to be cared for fully and comfortably from this estate for the remainder of her life. She is entitled to reside in our home, to draw from the trust's income for her living expenses, and to want for nothing that this estate can reasonably provide." Linda's shoulders relaxed slightly at that, some of the color returning to her face. And for a moment I thought perhaps the letter would end there gently, without the second half I already knew was coming. However, the judge read, and Linda's posture stiffened again at the shift in his tone. "She does not have authority to sell, transfer, liquidate, or otherwise dispose of principal assets held within the trust without the express written consent of my daughter Megan Sullivan, who I have named co-trustee effective upon the date of my death, a designation intentionally withheld from general knowledge at both my request and hers." A murmur moved through the gallery behind me. I didn't turn to look at it. I kept my eyes on the judge, on the paper in his hands, on the last physical trace of my father's voice I would likely ever hear again. "I have made this arrangement," the letter continued, "not out of mistrust toward my wife, but out of an understanding of human nature that I have earned through 71 years of living. People change when circumstances change. Grief changes people. Money changes people faster than almost anything else I have witnessed. I do not believe Linda intends harm, but I have seen enough in my life to know that intentions and actions do not always travel together, and I would rather protect what I built than assume the best and be wrong." The judge's voice remained steady, though I noticed it soften slightly on the next line. "My daughter has never once asked me for anything beyond my time and my honesty. She has built a life of service and discipline that I am prouder of than she will likely ever know, because she has never once required me to say it aloud for her to keep going. If any dispute arises over the handling of this trust, I trust her judgment above all others, not because she is my daughter, but because she has earned that trust through years of demonstrated integrity that this family, I suspect, has never fully seen. He set the letter down gently. The final provision, he said, reading once more, states that should the primary trustee engage in unauthorized liquidation of trust assets, all rights of administration transfer immediately and permanently to the successor co-trustee without further court proceeding required, though obviously the matter is now before this court for confirmation. The room felt different after that, the air itself somehow heavier. I looked at Linda, and for the first time since my father's funeral, I didn't see certainty in her face at all. I saw the particular kind of collapse that happens when a person realizes the story they told themselves for months, maybe years, was never actually true. That the man she'd shared a life with had seen something in her, or perhaps simply understood something about grief and money that she'd never allowed herself to consider. Preston stood slowly, clearly searching for footing that no longer existed. "Your Honor, I'd request a recess to consult with my client regarding these developments. That request is reasonable." The judge said, "Though I should note for the record that the sale of the vehicle, the paintings, and the fund transfers previously discussed all occurred after the date of Mr. Sullivan's death, and therefore fall squarely within the scope of this letter's final provision. I intend to address that directly once we resume." Linda didn't argue. She sat very still, staring at the letter in the judge's hands, as though she could will it into saying something different if she looked at it long enough. I watched her, and I felt no satisfaction in that moment, only a strange, quiet grief, sharper somehow than anything I'd felt standing in that ruined driveway 3 months earlier. My father had written that letter believing he was protecting his estate. But reading it now, I understood he'd also been protecting me, in a way he never said aloud while he was alive, and something about receiving that protection only after his death made it land heavier than I expected. The judge called for a 15-minute recess. As the room began to stir, Linda finally turned to look at me, and for the first time in 11 years, I saw something in her expression I hadn't seen before. Not anger. Not defiance, just the quiet, disoriented look of someone realizing far too late how little she'd actually understood about the family she thought she had already figured out. When the court reconvened, Judge Whitfield didn't waste time. He addressed the room with the same measured calm he'd carried through the entire hearing, though something in his tone now held a finality that hadn't been there before. Given the evidence presented and the explicit terms outlined in Mr. David Sullivan's trust and accompanying letter, he said, "This court finds that Mrs. Linda Sullivan engaged in unauthorized liquidation of trust assets following the death of the settlor in direct violation of the trust's governing provisions. All transactions in question, the sale of the vehicle, the sale of the 2 paintings, and the transfer of investment shares are hereby voided. Proceeds from those sales are to be returned to the trust in full, with Mrs. Sullivan bearing responsibility for any resulting shortfall." Tiny. Linda sat motionless beside Preston, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone pale. Furthermore, the judge continued, "Pursuant to the trust's terms, administrative authority transfers immediately and fully to Major Megan Sullivan as sole trustee. Mrs. Sullivan retains her right to residence and living support, as outlined in her late husband's letter, but all further decisions regarding trust assets rest solely with Major Sullivan going forward." He closed the folder in front of him. "This hearing is concluded." The gallery began to stir, quiet conversations breaking out in clusters, but I stayed in my seat a moment longer, letting the weight of it settle. 3 months of silence, of collecting documents late at night, of sitting through insults I never answered, all of it had led to this single unremarkable folder closing on a judge's bench. Linda didn't look at me as she gathered her things. I watched her shoulders shake slightly, and for a moment, I thought she might simply leave without a word. But near the doors, she stopped, turned, and walked back toward where I stood with Patricia. "I didn't know," she said, quietly, her voice stripped of every ounce of certainty it had carried 3 months earlier. "About any of it. The law degree, the trust. I thought—" She stopped, shook her head. "I thought I understood who you were." "Most people did," I said, not unkindly. There wasn't room left in me for cruelty, not after watching her collapse in real time under the weight of a truth she'd never bothered to ask about. "My father used to say a title only matters once someone else sees it for themselves. I think he was trying to protect me from people who'd only value me for what I could prove instead of who I actually was." She nodded slowly, tears finally slipping free, and for the first time in 11 years, I saw something honest in her face instead of certainty. I didn't offer forgiveness in that hallway, and I didn't need to. Some things take longer than a single conversation to repair if they can be repaired at all. But I told her the house would remain hers to live in exactly as my father intended, and that surprised her more than anything else that had happened that day. As we walked out of the courthouse into the July sunlight, Patricia asked me the question I'd been waiting for someone to ask for months. "Why did you wait so long to tell everyone who you really were?" I thought about my father's voice on all those late-night calls, patient and steady, teaching me things he never once demanded credit for. "Because he taught me that titles only mean something when other people discover them on their own," I said. "He never wanted me to announce my worth to a room. He wanted me to let the truth speak when it was ready." That evening I drove out to the small cemetery where he was buried, the same modest plot he'd chosen years earlier, despite Linda's suggestions of something grander. I knelt beside the headstone and set down the leather journal I'd finally gotten back that week, the one I'd asked for on the worst day of this whole ordeal. I opened it to the final page where his handwriting waited exactly as I remembered it. "If they ever look down on you because of the uniform, let the truth speak for you instead." I stayed there a long while as the sky began to change color, feeling for the first time in months something close to peace. I still think about that day often, how close I came to losing everything my father built, simply because no one thought to ask who I really was. I'd love to know what you think this story says about the people we underestimate. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from tonight. We share stories like this one every single day, so if this one stayed with you, consider subscribing so you never miss the next. Let's keep this journey going together.